Today on Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with David Robert Grimes. David is a scientist and author with a keen interest in the public understanding of science. He is the author of the critically acclaimed books Good Thinking: Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World. He writes on science and society for outlets including The Guardian, The Irish Times, Scientific American, The Atlantic, the BBC, Financial Times, and The New York Times. He frequently appears on news media across the world to discuss topics as diverse as viral health disinformation to cancer science, and gives talks around the world on the importance of evidence in society. Today, we talk about David's book, Good Thinking, and its applicability to people's day to day lives. His main message is for people to understand that it's okay to be wrong. And in that sense, we look at the many ways in which he and I and everybody are susceptible to many logical flaws. We also talk about how science and scientific progress tend to obviate these flaws, and we talk about some of the great contributors to science who nonetheless are not infallible themselves. It's a fascinating, wide ranging conversation, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with David Robert Grimes. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. David Robert Grimes, thank you very much for joining me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk to you today. I've read your book, which is called The Irrational Ape in the UK, but here in North America, it's called Good Thinking, and the subtitle is Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World. So, what is good thinking, and why is it important? And can you contrast it with bad thinking and why it's bad?
I think you can do that with nice historical examples. Yesterday was the anniversary of something really, really big. And I tweeted about it. The tweet kind of exploded. I think it's got 25,000 likes at the moment. But it was a story that's in the beginning of the book. And it was a story of an unsung Russian sailor called Vasily Arkhipov. And 60 years ago yesterday, which was the 27th of October, I don't know when this is going out, but it'll be around then, he was a flotilla commander on a submarine called the B-59. And this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is at the zenith of Cold War tensions, so to speak. And what had happened was, while Khrushchev and Kennedy were above the surface arguing about whether they shoot missiles in Cuba, what they didn't realize is the real drama was going on under the North Atlantic, right? Because this submarine was being pursued by the U.S. Navy. So a ship called the USS Randolph and 11 destroyers. And it had dived so deep it couldn't communicate with Moscow. The Americans were dropping depth charges to try and make it come back up, which unsurprisingly was interpreted as aggression, as you can imagine. But they were so deep down that they didn't know whether war had begun. And what the Americans did not know is that on that submarine was a single T5 nuclear torpedo, which would have vaporized the Randolph. They also didn't know that as long as the political officer and the captain agreed, they had autonomy to launch that weapon. The political officer and the captain were a bit rattled. It was 50 degrees Celsius for my American friends. That's 122 Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, they had no water. They were tired, sleep deprived. The oxygen was low and the carbon dioxide was high. None of these situations conducive to good decision making.
Yeah, exactly.
So they decided they were going to launch. The political officer and the captain said, right, we're going to launch. As you know, the world didn't end that day. So something else happened. What happened was, on board that ship was the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov. And because he was flotilla commander, he had an equal ranked vote. So all three men had to agree. And here's his logic, and I think it's really important to break it down. He said, if we launch this warhead, we have committed the entire world to war. If a war hasn't already begun, that's what we're going to do. If a war has begun, it's going to make no real difference in the scheme of things. He goes, the best thing we can do is resurface and communicate with Moscow, because that's not going to be on us. It turns out he was absolutely right. War had not begun. In fact, Khrushchev and Kennedy had just struck a deal about, Cuba. But Can you imagine how very different history would be had Vasily Arkhipov not gone through that reasoning process? And I think, to me, that's good thinking. It's, all right, what would happen if this happens? It's to not react. It's to be reflective rather than reactive, and to take all the facts that you have, to simulate all the possible outcomes that your actions would lead to, and then try to pick the best ones. And there's lots of things that prevent us from doing that. So that's an example of good thinking. And an example of bad thinking is what happened around the same time in China in 1958. I love this one too. China in 1958 had just, the communists had just won under Mao, and they wanted to do a Soviet Union. They wanted to take this rural agricultural society and make it into an industrial juggernaut. And they decided the best thing to do was to get rid of all their pests. So they had campaigns to get rid of flies because they spread disease, mosquitoes, same reason, and rats. But to this rogues gallery, they added a fourth, and I find a very strange one: the humble Eurasian tree sparrow. Now, you ever see a tree sparrow, you don't really think they're pests, they don't vector disease. But to the communists, they had political resonance. They were eating the grain that the farmers had sowed without doing anything to sow that grain. They were called the little animals of the bourgeoisie, right? They had like all these horrible terms for them. So they decided to kill them all. They banged pots and pans, so they were too scared to land. They smashed their nests up. They shot them in the sky. Within a year, they killed 1 billion sparrows. They'd rendered them extinct in China. Great, right? Not so good. Because while this was happening, and this is very much a political ideology that was masquerading as a scientific policy, that's another important thing in bad thinking. If your ideology is making you do things, it's not always the best thing to do. There was ornithologists warning them that this might backfire. Mao had them put in prison because that was Mao for you. But what actually happens is the biggest part of a diet for a Eurasian tree sparrow are insects, and specifically locusts. They are the only natural predator of locusts. When there was no longer any sparrows, locust populations exploded. In fact, the entire Mao's government had to do a huge volte fast. They had to import sparrows from the USSR, but it was too late. And within a year, their crops were destroyed. That led to the Great Chinese Famine, which killed somewhere between 15 and 45 million people. And that's, I think, what happens when critical thought becomes afterthought. That is an example where you didn't take all the evidence, where you pursued an agenda because it was confirmation bias or because ideologically it chimed with you, without thinking and balancing it all up and detaching. And I think so. That, to me, they're good examples of a failure with the Chinese and a success. And the Vasily Arkhipov one, because it was the 60th anniversary of the day, and the amount of people when I tweeted that, I'd never heard of that. And I'm like, yeah. And there was a few cases, by the way. That was not the only time we came that close.
Yeah, well, that it reminds me of the story of Stanislav Petrov,
Petrov.
I believe.
Yeah.
Yes, and there was a. I mean, obviously, the U.S. and Russia, or the USSR, excuse me, were during the Cold War were constantly on alert for the launch of nuclear missiles. They because
Yeah.
each
To get the
country
advantage.
was
Yeah,
threatening,
exactly.
and there was a Soviet outpost recorded a launch of a single missile, and they had redundant systems, so they double checked, and the other system said yes, in fact, it is a launch. And Stanislav Petrov did not report it up the chain because his reasoning was if the US was going to do an unannounced preemptive attack, it would be everything to
All
bury the
out.
country.
It
And
would have
so
to be.
he did, and this was, and it happened to be this, and it turned out to be a malfunction.
September 1983, Sepikov 15. Yeah, it was clouds. They picked up clouds in the detector.
But it happened to coincide with a very tense moment, completely unrelated, but a very tense moment geopolitically between the US and the USSR. And if he had reported it up the chain, there's a very good chance the USSR would have responded with a nuclear launch of its own based on a false. So this single, I guess, bureaucrat, his technician is probably the best word to describe him, by disobeying orders and not doing his job, uh, quite possibly prevented a nuclear war.
Do you know how he was rewarded for that? I write about him in the book too. Do you know how he was rewarded for saving?
I
I would argue
imagine, I don't, but I imagine that the word rewarded is being used ironically here.
he was reprimanded. He was told that he should have done it anyway. He was basically bullied out of his agency, and he went into civilian research. And it wasn't until I think about 5 years before his death that anyone even talked about this event. That was September 1983. There's also another one in the US. I don't have this one, but because I didn't want to do all nuclear disasters. But there was one where someone left training tapes in on a US simulator, and they stood up all the B-52 bombers. And they realized it was a training cassette because they used to use cassettes. Remember that in the old days of. So they were using them as a simulation thing, and just
Before
someone went,
discs,
"Yeah."
before USBs, before CD-ROMs.
Someone went, "This looks very similar to the training program," but they had already stood up the bombers, and luckily that was someone who just did the whole. I'm just going to check that before we nuke a different country. I'm just going to check that we're not running the training program, you know. So, but I mean, that shows you how close we can teeter to destruction. But I know you and I may never have to avert a nuclear disaster, but we have to make decisions every day, and we have to make ideally decisions that will benefit us, will benefit the world around us. You know, and you've seen it during the pandemic. Do I get vaccinated? Do I obey lockdown? All this kind of stuff, right? And you saw people, you know, covering themselves in glory, and a lot of people not so much, right? But the same logical processes were going on. And I think the best way to get that across to people is to tell stories, because humans are storytelling animals. You can give people a bunch of rules and say, well, this is the actual algorithm you follow. No, that's no good. We don't learn that way, or, you know, unless we're doing coding, we don't learn that way. So I just like stories because that's how I learn things. I get an example in my head and I'm like, okay, I don't want to do this where this happened. And I think that's a very human way to learn, because we are not automatons. We have this incredible logic and this incredible ability to marshal logic, but we're very much emotional creatures. Like, we often emote first and then, you know, dress it up to make it look like it was rational the whole time.
We justify the decision we've already made from with
A
our
lot of the
emotions
time.
using our faculties.
100%. And we don't like, and I mean, I make this point in the book at least 5 different times in different ways. We really don't like changing our minds. We don't like conceding that maybe the decision we made with information X is not the best decision. Now that we have information X plus Y, we should change our position. Because we have a thing called identity protective cognition, we identify ourselves as our ideas. It can be very hard for us to say, hey, I didn't get that right. But there's no shame in being wrong. There's only shame in refusing to update your position when the evidence comes in. So I think part of my motivation for writing the whole thing was to get that point across. I'm like, being wrong is great. You're going to be wrong most of the time. But as long as you give yourself the freedom to change your mind and give other people the freedom to change their mind, that's what we should be striving towards. The person who's right for the wrong reason is much more dangerous than the person that's wrong for the right reason. Because overall, you know, if you go by the right reasons, the right reasons will have you right more of the time. You can be a broken watch can be right twice a day, but you wouldn't want to use it to tell the time. So it's much more important to have the building blocks in place and follow that logic wherever it takes you, than to just, you know, go in your gut feeling and then say, well, I was always right because I was right last time. That's a really bad heuristic we like to use, you know.
Right. So one of the things that I took away from your book is the really astonishing array of ways, the variety, the number and the variety of ways in which our intuitions can mislead us. Things that seem to make sense, that seem on surface level quite reasonable, or approach that can take us down erroneous paths. And but then I look around at at my life and the life of people around me, and we make, as you said, hundreds of decisions every day, and for the most part, we're not living in a crisis situation, but for the most part, we do make good decisions based on evidence, based on knowledge and reason, and an understanding of what the likeliest consequences can be. And I'm hoping you can help me reconcile the astonishing number of ways we can go wrong with the fact that under most circumstances, most of the time, most of us get it mostly right.
I think you're far more optimistic than me. I would say that we get it wrong most of the time, but the consequences are usually not severe.
Let's talk about it. We have different perspectives here, and let's explore that.
I give you one that, I mean, I love, because it shows how our reasoning is a little bit. Now, you might know the answer to this, and hopefully you do. But so you've probably heard. Have you ever heard of the Monty Hall problem?
I have heard of the Monty Hall problem.
So you know the answer to it. But the vast majority of people, and so the Monty Hall problem for the listeners is that there are three doors on a TV show, and behind one of these doors is a sports car, and behind the other two is a goat. Very specific, isn't it? Goat sports car. It's based on Let's Make a Deal, a 1950s American TV show. And the host was Monty Hall, so sometimes called the Monty Hall problem. So you pick a door, say you pick door A, then the host will show you one of the two doors you did not pick. So B or C in this case. And he'll show you the one with a goat in it, not the one with a sports car. That would really defeat the purpose of this exercise. And he'll then ask you, do you want to stay with your original choice or do you want to switch? The vast majority of people will say it makes no odds. It's 50-50. There's now two doors. The strategy, you should always switch. 2/3 of the time, switching will win you the sports car. And that is, by the way, incredibly alien to our intuition. Now, when I teach this in a whiteboard, I do a lot of different ways. I did one on my Instagram a while ago, the Instagram Live, where I did it, because people don't believe you. They go, no, no, no. Like, how can it make it's 50-50? I'm like, but it's not. Your 1/3 chance was still a 1/3 chance. And then the remainder of the probabilities was 2/3 together. When one of those went to zero, it means the other one has gone to 2/3. And there's fancy other ways of showing that. That is not intuitive to us. In fact, most of the decisions we make or most of the strategies we take are suboptimal. People queue in the wrong place in shops. You go to a shop and there's multiple queues. People tend to join the longest queue. That's interesting. They are not efficient in their queuing techniques. We're not efficient in our driving thing. I'm out in New York at the moment. No one's efficient in their driving, right? It's good enough that we get by and it doesn't cause us any serious harm. But I wouldn't say it's always good.
Okay. The heuristics that we follow are, yeah, I guess, are good enough to avoid catastrophic or very bad consequences. Uh, and there's lots of ways that our thinking can go wrong. That goes from flawed premises to faulty logic, and the one that I have the most trouble with are bad actors that are deliberately deceiving you.
Giving little bits of
It's
misleading
hard.
information.
It's hard enough to get things right when you have, perhaps
Good
incomplete, but at
information.
least
Yeah.
accurate information to deal with. But when you have to start questioning the source of all of your data, and then essentially nothing is reliable, or can be viewed as 100% reliable, it gets really, really hard sometimes. How is it that we became, given that you and I and like nobody is immune to bias or flawed reasoning, how did we become the dominant species on the planet? How do we overcome all of these flaws,
Yeah.
and get it right enough of the time that we do have 8 billion or close to 8 billion of us, and are by any reasonable measure the dominant species of the planet.
Yeah, and partly the answer is because it's a pretty low bar to get there. Now, what humans are very, very good at doing is manipulating our environment. We have, roughly speaking, two modes of thought. Some of the stuff you're describing there, the heuristic stuff, what we are really good at doing, and most of our mammal brothers and sisters are very good at this, we are very good at rapid rules of thumb that are usually good enough to get us by. They mightn't be the optimal path, but they're a path that gets us there. Okay? Um, like the example is the rustling in the bushes. You hear a rustling in the bush behind you. It's probably the wind, but you're going to jump around and look at that on the off chance that it's a tiger, right? That's an evolutionary strategy. Is it optimum? Maybe not, but it's you also have what humans have is metacognition. We have a very slow but very effective way of mulling over problems. That's the analytical thought where you have to go, okay, I'm going to weigh this up. It's slow, it's cognitively expensive. What we do is, for example, we often reduce problems to one previously solved, even if it doesn't exactly match. The classic example, Dan Kahneman did this years ago with the Linda problem. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with the Linda problem, it's one I love because I like seeing how my students answer this. So he gave a description of a woman called Linda. Linda was 31 years old. She is very outspoken, smart, into social justice. She protests against nuclear power. She takes part in demonstrations. They ask, what's more likely? Is A, Linda a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and a feminist? Right? Now, obviously, the language is dated somewhat, but this is 1971. Most people will answer that with that Linda is active in the feminist movement. And the reason now, logically, that's actually not true. It's more true that she's just a bank teller because in the second one, she's a bank teller and something else. The probability of those two things together is lower than any one occurring
Right,
on its
but
own.
but the thinking is that she's more likely to be a feminist, given all the other characteristics that she has, than she is to be a bank
Exactly.
teller. But that's not the question that you asked.
No, but that's what humans are doing. You are asked what's more likely, and the answer is quite obviously she's a bank teller. But the way we're not answering that question directly. When we use heuristics, we are reducing Linda to a previously solved person that had those characteristics that roughly, well, most of the women I know that are very outspoken in social justice would describe themselves as feminists. We're using representativeness. And that's what Kahneman's insight, and I think is really good here. He's showing you that we don't actually solve problems with the logical, rigorous way is to show probability A, probability B, do it in the whole thing. It takes ages if you do it properly. He's saying that it's usually right. Like if someone is active in social justice, they're most likely going to be for the equal rights of women. That's the representativeness we're using. And that's not going to cause us any harm for the most part. That's not going to cause us harm. It causes us harm like when we're making jury decisions. It causes us harm when we're working out what we should buy or how we should combat climate change. This is stuff that demands that we sit down there and do things rigorously and analytically. We cannot rely on our gut feeling, our instincts, our heuristics to do that. And most of the problems that I think the existential problems we face as a species right now in the world are not gut feeling problems. They're going to require sustained, considered thought to solve on everyone's behalf. And until we can do that, we're going to be misled. The other example you see this with is with rhetoric. How can politicians, people like Donald Trump, how can they mislead so many people? And partially it's because he's appealing to, what he says appeals to people's sense that they're disenfranchised. He's playing on that, like all demagogues throughout history have. It doesn't matter if what he's saying is consistent. What he's telling his audience is that you're special, and I'm going to get the people that don't make you feel special. That's a heuristic. That's like he's on our side against them. If they actually run you go, well, actually, he's giving tax breaks to billionaires, and he's really screwing us poor people. Until we learn to ask those hard, detached questions, we rely on the emotive aspect of it or the quick and easy, it roughly fits my prejudices. And I don't think that's good enough for us. I think we can do better. I think we will do better.
So, how do we get people to engage with their uh, more cognitively expensive rational brains instead of the heuristically driven emotional reactions to politicians or other public figures? How do we get people to say, not that to use an American example, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, but instead say, I've looked at the policies of the Democratic Party and I've looked at the policies and the leaders of the Republican Party. And based on my own personal values, I align more with one or the other. But that's not what happens a lot of the
No,
time.
it's
People
not.
say people say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and then when each party says these are our priorities, it's like, well, because the party has said this is what's important to me, and they allow the third party essentially to determine their own morals or their own values or their own priorities. And and I guess the,
Yeah.
the the quintessential example of that was just before he was even the leader of the party, when Donald Trump said I could shoot someone in cold blood
On
on the
Fifth
street in
Avenue. Yeah, yeah.
Manhattan and not lose a single voter. Like, he was tapping into the fact that people identify as Republicans, and that type of partisanship I don't think is unique to that party.
But he wasn't even just tapping into Republicans. He was tapping into a branch of people that have come to dominate the Republican Party by there was once upon a time set moderate Republicans and conservative ones, but he's used that party apparatus to fill it with yes men. And actually, I resent them more, by the way, than I resent Trump. Trump is a fool. I mean, I don't think anyone listening to this is going to probably. He's a horrific human being, but he's been enabled to a huge degree by people that think they can control him, think they can leverage him. So I have a lot more contempt for the intelligent people around there who decided to throw their lot in with him because I think they morally failed themselves on a huge level. But to answer that one, it's really good one. I would even say, look, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. I say, I agree with the Democratic Party stance on this particular issue. I think we should realize that we can be that selective. It's not our identity. When you say I'm a Democrat, you're finding an identity for yourself, which means that you're more prone to tribalism.
Yeah, and so how do we combat that? I agree entirely. So how do we combat that type of partisanship, that type of tribalism?
I think we got to realize that firstly, tribalism it has an evolutionary purpose. There was a reason we used to be tribal. Like we go, well, because it was survival. That's no longer the case. Tribalism now is usually it's very rooted in identity protective cognition. These are my people. This is this kind of thing. You see it even in movements like QAnon, the anti-vaccine movement. They get this identity where facts no longer matter. They've created this. You know, I mean, during the pandemic, I'm sure you heard this. I hear people say things in the same breath. They would say, "COVID is a hoax, but it's caused by 5G, and you can cure it with ivermectin." They would say three things that were mutually exclusive. But what matters is, but the mistake that I would make there, and I think if you think of this as pure logic, that is absolutely lamentable. But no, they had a feeling. Their identity was they knew more than the authorities. The authorities were lying to them. So they didn't care about the internal inconsistency. They cared about feeling like they were these others, these brave others against the sinister them. Trump does that too with his followers. Trump lies all the time. Trump is so inconsistent. I don't think Trump could order breakfast without lying, right? But it doesn't matter because you realize that the people following him they're disenfranchised, and they have put this kind of, this is our tribe, he's our guy. Now he is not their guy. He's a self-serving fool. But how do we get people away from that? I think you have to slowly and gently, and this is a very important thing because discussion is always better than debate on this. If you can bring people around to seeing those inconsistencies themselves, if you can plant the seed. So I've been asked about this. One of the most common questions I get is from people who've read my book and say, "Look, I have a family member who's an anti-vaxxer, or QAnon, or Trumpist, and how do I show them this is not right?" And I go, one of the most powerful questions I've ever used. I deal with vaccine hesitant parents a lot in work, and one of the most now. I say vaccine hesitant. There's a spectrum. If someone's died in the wool anti-vaccine, they're not even going to talk to me. I'm not even going to get there. But I'm not trying to change them. It's the people in the middle who don't know exactly what to believe. That's where I'm going to concentrate my efforts. And what I often say, even the ones who are leaning skeptical, I would say, okay, like, so why do you think that? And then I like to ask, what evidence could I give you that would help change your mind? What data would help you? What would reassure you? You know, and when you actually do them, they often answer their own question. In my experience, if you let them identify inconsistencies, so I often, not in politics as much, it's usually vaccine stuff. They come to me with a rake of claims, and I go, okay, let's take, if this claim is true though, it contradicts this claim down here, and they'll go, oh yeah, and you've planted the seed, that little seed of doubt, and then you talk to them a few weeks later, and they're like, yeah, I don't really believe that anymore. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a win. They're never going to credit me and say, thanks, you changed my mind. Because no one ever changes anyone else's mind. You give people the seeds to change their own and the freedom to change their own. No one has ever changed your mind. They've given you a better argument that you've sat with, and you've went, yeah, you know what? I'm adopting that argument. It's mine. So the whole trick, if you really want to change people's minds, you often don't go in there shaking your fists and, screaming. That I used to do that. It doesn't work. What does work is a conversation where you go, and oftentimes in these conversations, particularly with, say, politics, you find that people are upset about something else. Trump voters are a good example. I think a lot of them felt disenfranchised to some level, and they felt this person was going to fix their problems and make America great again, which is such an empty phrase, but they obviously felt like their lot wasn't very good. And when you start digging into, maybe they're being totally unfair, you find that the reason they support someone isn't necessarily for the reasons you'd think. It's they're often identifying themselves as the opposite of that, and they just feel this is our champion, whatever else. But if you can get them to ask those questions themselves, to find those internal inconsistencies, to just plant the little seed of doubt where they can sit with it, they'll never give you the credit. They'll never come into you and go, "Thanks for that, buddy." But you'll talk to them weeks later, and they'll be like, "Yeah, I don't think that's true
Well,
anymore."
that I mean, and I guess it depends on whether you're into having that conversation for the personal glory or to accomplish a goal. And if you do the latter, that if you're there to just accomplish the goal, then I think I think it was Eisenhower. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was Eisenhower who said that uh, there's really nothing you can't accomplish as long as you don't care who gets the credit.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I'd like to source that and steal it because that's brilliant.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it was a U.S. president. I think it was Eisenhower, but I'm pulling it from memory, and I think you will appreciate that I'm willing to acknowledge that my memory is
No,
fallible.
no, absolutely. And Joe, it's a great quote because it is true. If you are, and sometimes people in the skeptic and atheist movement, and I know they mean well, but they go in with this. And I gave out about it in the book myself in the last few chapters. That when you take the haughty tone, like, "Oh, you people, you're so stupid," or "This is so dumb," you've just shut the door on getting people converted. And look, it's not for everyone. Not everyone has the patience, the endurance. I mean, the time investment can be huge. I talked an aunt who was anti-vaccine out of it, but it took, I would say, 3 months of conversations. 3 months, which is a huge time investment. Now, I like her. She's a good person, but she's very into her woo. She's very into her crystal healing. And if you look at her health history, she's had very bad luck with her health. And the people she hangs around have convinced her that if she uses stupid healing crystals or whatever else, she won't get sick again. So she's clutching to that with a fervor that is not evidence based because she's afraid of being sick. Her true motivation is that she's afraid of being sick again. And that has brought her into the orbit of people that will go from crystal healings to, oh, by the way, vaccines are poison. So knowing what I know about her and knowing that her real fear was getting sick or getting sicker, I could then show her the argument like, look, people that get vaccinated can still get sick, but they get nowhere near as sick as the people that don't. So if your
Yeah.
goal is to avoid hospitalization, your best strategy.
Often, like, there's that straw man argument. It's like, yeah, how many people got vaccinated and still got sick? Well, that was never the claim of the vaccine manufacturers, right? It was never that it complete immunity. It's not a sterilizing vaccine, but but they are effective. I remember that uh, I used to say two things. It was like just before the pandemic. One is, if you want to convince somebody of something, just you have to meet them where they are. You have to
Yeah,
start
that's
where they are,
absolutely
and then
right.
you can bring them to where you are, to where you think is a more reality based position. But you can't start from here, shout across the chasm. And the other point that I found to be quite true is that you can't simply reason somebody out of a position,
They didn't reason themselves into. Yeah.
right? And those are related, right? You have to start, if they're there for an emotional reason, you have to start with that emotion. You have to touch and find the
And I would
common
say
ground,
most of
and
it,
then you
yeah.
can walk together to a new place.
I think you're right. And I think most of our positions, and even I do this myself. I often ask a question to myself because I give myself a lot of permission to be wrong these days. When I was younger and more arrogant, I think I was like, you can't be wrong. You're a science person. Now I'm like, yeah, I'm probably wrong. And it's actually liberating. And allowing yourself to be wrong and go, okay, well, maybe I'm not exactly right on this read. That's quite nice because you're no longer in this kind of position to defend, to fight. You're like, I just want to learn. So this is what I feel right now with the data I have. What would change my mind on this? And it's actually kind of liberating. I think if everyone embraced that, we'd let go of this, oh, I have to be right. We go, this is so nice that I can just go, I'm here to learn. Like literally, like that's life. We're here to learn, right?
Yeah.
And we don't do that. We go, no, I'm here to be on the right side. Well, sometimes there's no right side, or sometimes the ground shifts so much. One of the ones that I see, and we had CSI Con the other day, and one of the things that was amazing was like there's great people there, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Timothy Caulfield, and we took photographs. And there was people going on there going, "You're murdering people. You're not wearing masks." Really angry replies to these tweets. And I thought to myself, you see, you're treating the situation like it's still April 2020, when we didn't have vaccines and we didn't have a reduction in risk from transmission, right? And equally, the anti-vaxxers are using the same argument. They're going, oh, well, the vaccine's supposed to be great, and look, it's not good against this variant. Yeah, because it was developed for a different disease. The fact that it's still, it's the shifting, and that's what I mean. Like, their positions are unyielding. They are very binary. When in reality, you constantly have to update your position based on how the evidence base changes. The best strategy one day will not be, it's just a chess game. The best strategy one day may not be the best strategy the next day. Your personal calculus and risk appetite is going to come into that. And it was just interesting to me see how angry people got, particularly at Neil deGrasse Tyson. They were like, oh. And I'm like, no, firstly, he was mainly wearing a mask. He just took them off for a photograph. And the second thing I was thinking is everyone in that room was vaccinated. It was a science and skepticism conference. Where I'm from in Ireland, we have 98% vaccine uptake. 98%. We couldn't wait to get back to the pub. So we all just rushed down and said, yeah, shoot. Over in America, it's near 63, I believe, is the figure. So it's a big difference in America. You might be in a room with people who are unvaccinated. It is exceedingly unlikely in Ireland you're going to encounter those people in the wild, so to speak, because the ones who didn't get vaccinated tended to be in a fringe anyway. And I guess it's mapping one set of data to another. the situation always, always have taken the base rate has to be taken into account at all stages, you know. But it's hard to have a single answer that fits everything. It's always going to have to be reflected at that time.
So related to that, yeah. I mean, that sounds exhausting. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was reading your book is uh, finding the right balance. How to find the right balance between breadth and depth, and and
Yeah,
and it occurred to me, or the example that I was thinking of is that I like to stay informed, so I read a lot of journalism, a lot of news articles. On a whole range of topics, I want to know what's happening. I'm based in Canada, but I want to know what's happening not just in Canada, but also in the United States, in Europe, and Africa, and Asia, or all around the world, and you know, politics, economics, all sorts of things. I'm a very curious person,
which is
and
great.
well, thank you. But when I was reading the book, and you give, over the course of a few hundred pages, all sorts of cautions. You have to be careful when you're absorbing new information to think about, this, and you have to think about that, and you have to evaluate what the source is and how that compares with existing knowledge. And I thought, and as I'm reading your book, I'm agreeing with all of it. It all makes sense. It's well written, it's well explained. But then it occurred to me, it's going to take me an hour to read a standard news article if I follow your advice and actually critically evaluate every claim, every sentence, every the thrust of the article. And if I can either read it in a couple of minutes and retain some portion of that in my memory, or I can critically evaluate it, but I'm only going to read one or two articles in a day.
That's an excellent point, but there's good news. I have good news for you. Okay,
Okay.
because this is what I tell when I get my students to read scientific papers. If they're really invested in that area and they're going to have to make decisions in that area, we critique the hell out of them. We do it properly. It can take you hours to read a paper, right? But if you're trying to get background information and it's not affecting your judgments or your decisions, it's just to get color and context or something,
Hmm.
you don't have to put the same level of depth into it. If I read a New York Times piece, unless I'm basing a decision off that, I'm going to assume the reporting is fairly accurate. It may not be perfect. Now, I know if it's my area of expertise and I read their reporting, I'll be like, my God, they got that wrong, or they got the year wrong on that. Well, that's minor, right? It's what's going to annoy me because I know it. Where it starts to matter is if you read a newspaper piece that said you shouldn't get vaccinated because the Calgary Sun says this, right? Then you're going to have to be more critical with that. But if you're just taking it in kind of a passive read where it's like, okay, this is interesting, and I'm not putting all my eggs in this basket, I think that's okay. But you're right. If you read everything with the critical lens of fact checking every sentence and checking the context is correct, you wouldn't be able to do it. Um, so the way I kind of break this down, and I take it from a science approach, I have to read dozens of papers every week. I don't read most of them in great depth. I read them well enough to kind of, this is what they said. If it's my area of expertise or directly affects an area of research that I work in, I read that with a far more um, meticulous eye. And I think that's, you choose your battles. You're like, okay, what do I need to? If this is something that matters, it's going to shape my decisions. It's going to shape how I interpret the world. Well, then I'd like to know it's very rigorous. But I also think the other thing you got to do, particularly with news, is you got to take all news stories as provisional. If you look at news, if you say a disaster unfurls, what we do know about disasters happening is initial reporting is almost always wrong. It's always corrective. And science, by the way, is very similar. Initial reports are almost always wrong. They become increasingly corrective. So you don't stake your entire thing on this story. That's what I feel about this. You kind of go, okay, this is interesting. I wonder if they'll update that in future. Where it becomes a problem or something you have to be cognizant of is when you're making decisions on it. So I hope I can relieve you of that burden a little bit by saying it's great that you do that, but you're right. You see how much cognitive expense you have to put into it if you're doing that all the time. We just hope, and this is where sources matter, because we do kind of offset this a little bit. We kind of hope that our media editors will do a good job of reporting. They don't always. We've seen horrific failures in journalism over the past few years, but we hope that if I read a reputable newspaper, that their editorial staff will take their job seriously. The same way I hope my mechanic puts my car back together properly so that my tires don't come off when I'm driving. If you worried about every component of that, you'd never be able to function. It's only when it becomes a matter of serious importance or life or death that you probably do have to worry that much. But ideally, this is where sources and reliability matters as well, because you are always putting a bit of trust into the validation of an external source. How much you should put in and how much you should balance it depends on your level of expertise in that area. If I read science reporting on an area I know very well, I probably know more than the journalist. So I can kind of see where they've cut corners. But if they're talking about business stuff, I don't know about that. I just have to hope that if Paul Krugman's writing a column, that he actually knows something about economics. And even then, with the caveat that he could be wrong. So
Right. He's one person with a particular perspective on things with his own biases, and there are other economists who adore him and still others who think he's a crank.
And you look at the good example of that. We were talking before we started recording about Talib. What's oh
Nicholas Taleb.
yeah, he's wrong on almost everything. Like he's an anti-GMO, I would say anti-science crank on some things. But he's right on other things. People's expertise is probably far more narrow than we'd like to admit. No one's right about everything.
That reminds me of something that I read in your book, and you talk about Linus Pauling, who was an esteemed physicist, made tremendous contributions, and towards the end of his life, which was a long one, he wrote quite extensively about the benefits of vitamin C, and he took enormous quantities of vitamin C. He
Huge
was
quantities.
generally a very healthy individual, and he did live a good, long, generally healthy life. And without detracting from his legacy and his contributions to physics in any way, his contributions or his hypothesis about vitamin C um, have has not stood the test of time. And you talk about that, and I would like to I'd like you to talk about um, you know, was this a case of people saying, well, that doesn't make any sense and we're just rejecting that out of hand? Or was it a case of people saying, oh, well, here's someone who is a scientist, knows the scientific process, and is revolutionized things in one area, maybe he's revolutionizing in another, looked at it seriously, and found it wanting. So can you talk about why
Yeah.
why his contributions that changed how we think about things in one area have been widely accepted, and then his proposition that would require us to change how we think about things in another area were not? Because I found that fascinating,
It's
and I don't,
brilliant. Yeah.
and I would like you to talk about what went into the broader acceptance and rejection of two of his groundbreaking proposals.
Yeah. So Linus Pauling, by background, is the only person on Earth to have won two solo Nobel Prizes. He won one for chemistry, I think, and one for peace on his own. People have won two within groups, but so he's an impressive man. And in the late '60s, or sorry, early '60s, he expressed the wish that he could live a long life so he could see what happens in the fields of science he loved. And he came across a man called Irwin Stone who told him the elixir of life is ultra high dose vitamin C. When we say ultra high dose, we mean like 3 grams a day, like a lot of vitamin C, right? And immediately, Linus Pauling started reporting feeling better, and he wrote a book called Vitamin C and the Common Cold. It came out in 1971. The only problem was these weren't actually new ideas. They had been tested and found lacking. And most of Linus Pauling's arguments was, it worked for me. Now, anecdotal evidence in medicine is extremely problematic because you're not double blinding it. You don't know, it's very subjective whether you feel better or not. I don't have a machine that tells you that. And also, like, you're not doing it with groups of people, which you'd have to do. But other people had looked at groups of people and it didn't work, right? Nonetheless, because he was promoting this so aggressively, pharmacists started running out of vitamin C stock. And vitamin C in the common cold was a huge seller. There was an editorial in JAMA that year, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that said, I fear because a Nobel Prize winner has written this, we're going to be stuck with patients asking us about vitamin C. How right they were. Because I'm sure now, over 3 or 4 decades later, 5 decades later, you still have doctors shaking their head going, will vitamin C cure that, doc? Turns out he was entirely wrong. And he went further. He claimed that vitamin C would cure cancer, snakebite, AIDS. Every new disease that came up, Linus Pauling insisted vitamin C would cure it. What was the difference between the Linus Pauling that won the Nobel Prize and the Linus Pauling that became a bit of a crank for vitamin C? The difference was evidence. For what Linus Pauling had won, so scientists aren't priests of some arcane religion. They're only as good as the evidence they can proffer, right? And in the field that they offer. He was a genius at at molecular chemistry, absolute genius, and he could prove it. He had the evidence to back it up. The problem with vitamin C is he was relying on he was resting on his laurels as a genius to think that he didn't need evidence. You always need evidence, always, right? And we sometimes call this Nobel Prize disease. By the way, there's a lot of examples of people winning Nobel Prizes for something very laudable and then kind of believing their own hype and deciding they don't need evidence again. Luc Montagnier won the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV and is now a homeopathy person and claims that he's also a COVID skeptic. Just because you have expertise in one field doesn't mean it's translatable. And I think a lot of scientists forget what makes us trustworthy is not who we are or what we do. It's that what we do pivots around evidence. It pivots around transparency of that evidence. If I make an argument, I have to show you why that argument is true. And again, I think a very human thing is if people spend their entire career telling them how great you are, you might forget that your job description is built on evidence. The most humble undergraduate student can disprove the life thesis of the most renowned Nobel laureate because evidence is what matters. The reputation is, and the reason why that matters to us, why people would listen to Linus Pauling, is because we do a thing called, we appeal to expertise, it's appeal to authority. There was an authority who's well respected for being an expert. So I think the quick representativeness heuristic that we all do is, well, he must know what he's talking about. Well, maybe he does. Or maybe he's believed his own hype.
Yeah, but that's what we do. So unlike you, I am not a scientist. I took a couple of courses in high school, and I think one or two possibly as an undergrad. But I it's not my profession. It's an interest at best for me. So when it comes, so I don't. I understand the process because it's an interest of mine, but I don't apply it day to day. So when it comes to learning about what's about the universe, right? Whether science, biology, physics, biology, chemistry, whatever, I effectively am reliant on authoritative figures or authoritative sources. I'm not double checking the facts. I'm not reproducing any experiments. I'm not doing the analysis of the results to see if the conclusions are warranted based on what they did. What I am doing is reading media reports and looking at critics whom I trust for whatever personal reasons, using
Absolutely.
whatever criteria I use personally to deem someone is a trustworthy source. Is what I'm reading, does it sound like an objective, reasonable sounding analysis, or does it sound to me like a polemic and they're using rhetorical flourishes in their argument? And these are perhaps reasonable heuristics, but they are subject to um, uh, errors. So, how do people, non-scientists like yourself, or sorry, like non-scientists like me, as opposed to scientists like you, avoid the Pauling trap of saying, like, here is a scientist. There is no there like he obviously understands the scientific method. He's someone who has made enormous contributions. There's no question that he is an above average, perhaps genius level intelligence that is applied in this particular field. Why wouldn't I give him the benefit of the doubt or someone
Absolutely.
else like that when they make what are admittedly surprising claims about vitamin C or or anything else?
Yeah. And do you know what? That is a brilliant question. And I think I have an answer to it because we saw it during the pandemic, and I wrote for Scientific American about this. We had an abundance of fringe experts during the pandemic. You'd have your CDC and your public health body saying one thing, and you'd go on Twitter and you'd find a rake of
Yeah, you'd find people like me who became an expert overnight with no background in it.
but you'd also find people that did have scientific backgrounds saying very strange things. You remember the pandemic that bloody stupid I say documentary that claimed that the pandemic was a scam. They had
I've heard
Judy.
about it, but I never actually
You're
saw it.
missing nothing. But it
Okay.
was very popular. It was Judy Mikovich, who has got a scientific qualification. There's plenty of figures that have Andrew Wakefield, for example, with MMR vaccines, was a doctor. Right? A lot of people during COVID were going to these doctors on Twitter who grew huge followings. Asim Malhotra in the UK, Robert Malone in the US. Um, they were doctors and scientists, right? And that's what people were saying. Well, I'm following them. But here's the thing: a doctor or a scientist is only doing medicine or science in as long as they're following the evidence. If they go off piste, it means nothing. So what really matters is scientific consensus. Individual experts can be wrong for all sorts of reasons. They can have their own biases. They can just be wrong about things, right? So what we do is we synthesize the evidence, and that's how we get expert consensus. And what I try to tell people is that's why you should listen to the WHO or the CDC, and not like some random doctor you're reading on Twitter, because the random doctor you're reading on Twitter is giving their opinion, which may or may not be informed, right? But also is not like, I mean, a consensus, a convergence of experts now. To get doctors and scientists to agree, it's like herding cats. We're a disagreeable bunch, right? So if we actually can get to the point where we say this is what we'd recommend as health policy or scientific policy, it's usually based on pretty good evidence. That's the heuristic I would use as a person going, should I trust the weird doctor on Twitter who says that we're all going to die of monkeypox? Or will I trust the CDC's advice to minimize my chances of getting this? And the CDC is the one I would trust because they have a massive public health team with all sorts of academic connections who've sat there and had meetings and worked out the evidence, and strong opinions have been shared behind closed doors, and they still arrive at a consensus. And I think if we made that process more transparent, and I always say, if scientists could do more to make that process transparent, say the reason why the individual opinion is not as strong as the group opinion is that the group opinion has often considered the weaknesses of the individual opinion, and so that's why you're missing the point.
So how do we place trust in the group opinion when we know that one of the major human fallacies is something called groupthink, where people suppress their own objections to a thought in order to fit in, even if nobody actually thinks this is a good idea.
Yeah,
But in order to go along, and like I guess the best example of that was the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, where the people in the room making the decision knew it was wrong, but they thought everyone else thought it would be a good idea. And that sometimes you do get groups of people that make worse decisions than individuals.
it happens in corporate culture an awful lot because people are worried that they'd be thought of it. The one good thing I would say to people concerned about scientists getting involved in this, because you sometimes saw people, oh, well, how do you know scientists aren't doing that? Science is by definition an adversarial process. I am supposed to go, no, I'm fighting this position based on this evidence. Disagreement is encouraged. And what you find, for example, let's say you come up with a hypothesis A, and I go, well, no, that's nonsense because I can show that the first premise you've made is wrong. And you go, well, actually, what about this? And it is a synthesizing thing, but you never come from a. I'd love to let people see how scientific meetings work. You have people vehemently disagreeing. I think you're very unlikely to get groupthink in those situations where you're supposed to fight your corner and then work out which position is strongest and then kind of make them together until you have it. Um, I understand the concern about it, but my understanding of groupthink as a thing is it's usually a kind of it's usually a least resistance thing. That usually people want to go along what they think their superiors and their colleagues do. Science, by definition, is about the evidence. Now, I can argue about the evidence. Is that a 6 or a 9? I can argue with that. I need some more context clues to work out if I should be a 6 or a 9, right? But that argument takes, and you're expected to have that argument. And whatever remains after you've had the argument, after you've tested your ideas, whatever remains as the best explanation is what you go with. So it is by definition adversarial. And the good news, I think, which I hope this reassures listeners a bit, the one good bit news that even though it takes a long time, it usually means what you're left with is pretty robust.
And that's why we have podcasts on the internet, well, we listen to on our computers and our cell phones, because we've got the technologies based on the scientific principles that have been arrived at through this process.
Yeah, pretty. And I mean, look, science is a very imperfect process, right? It's slow, it's arduous. Those arguments might seem pedantic as hell to anyone on the outside, and I often will have arguments with colleagues, particularly modeling stuff, over the most esoteric minutia, but it actually is vital. it's vital that you know every part of what you're doing. And even though it's slow, self-correcting, laborious, I'd much prefer a world where you're doing it that way and coming up with something lasting and robust than when you don't really know what you're doing and you're a black box crossing your fingers and hoping. So science is slow, and I understand people's frustration with it. But the reason it's slow is that it does that thing where it's always trying to disprove itself. Good science goes on by, I come up with an idea. I don't try to prove my idea. I try to subject it to the most extreme tests to see if something else fits it. So you're trying to break your idea. You come up with a beautiful thing, and you're like, this is a beautiful theory. Let me kill it. And if you can't kill it, it probably is pretty beautiful.
Well, I've got about 20 questions, but I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'll give you the last word. I like everything that you've said, but there's an assumption embedded in that I want to uh, not challenge, but delve into, and that is,
Flesh out. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and that is, you're assuming that everyone agrees to the ground rules, that everyone is being honest, that people are presenting the data accurately, that they are engaging in this disputation in good faith. And that's great if everyone's doing that. But I
Yeah.
think it's safe to say not everyone does that. People fake their data, they commit fraud, they lie, and they say, the statistics say X, and you might say, well, that's funny, the statistics say Y. How do you find, when you're engaged in that disputation, how do you determine whether the people that you're talking with are engaging in that conversation in good faith? And as an external observer or someone who's not a part of it, how can you identify those that are being open and honest? This is what we found, these are the limitations, and, versus those that are cleverly simply
Hiding
advancing
things.
advancing their agenda. And they'll pick on evidence, they'll cherry pick the evidence if it supports them, or cheerfully make up their own. And that
Yeah.
can be very difficult, for at least in my experience as someone who's not a part of that process, to tell the difference between the two. And I'm hoping that perhaps you have some insight.
I might have a bit of a strange insight to this because actually, a lot of my career, about half of it, when I'm not dealing with misinformation stuff and cancer science, the other half is meta research and research integrity. I am very interested in making sure that science is done well. And it's often not, by the way. I mean, science is the best tool we have, but it's very imperfect. Findings, that's why I never get excited about a finding in a single paper. I'm like, oh, big whoop, it's probably wrong. That's how I read most things these days. I'm probably wrong or exaggerated. Um, what matters is firstly the totality of evidence. But the other thing I'll say is science needs transparency. So I spend a lot of my time debunking bad research. A lot of my time these days is I recently published a paper on an automated method for detecting likely research abuse, right? That's the kind of stuff that I would do in my spare time. But one of the things you can say in science, and it's a lovely thing, is I don't believe you. Show me your data. I'd like to see it, right? And people who are cherry picking, bending, committing fraud, they will come up with, well, you can't see that because it's mine. But science has moved more and more in recent years towards transparent data. We call open data, because there was people bending the rules, faking things, or exaggerating, and I've come across many of them. But they get caught out by their peers very quickly, because eventually you see a result that's just too good to be true, and you'll ask the question, "Where did you get that?" I don't believe that. I've done that experiment myself. It doesn't work that way. And when you get their data, you often find out that they didn't do it. And that paper is eventually retracted. It's time consuming, but I think it's less and less likely to happen as science moves on. Because as we move more and more towards open data, open tools, open sharing, it's an awful lot harder to commit fraud if people are auditing you. And in theory, anyone in science, like I had someone email me last week asking for data from a paper that I released in 2014. And luckily, I had the data. I was like, cool, yeah, no problems. Here's the data. And now I wasn't looking to commit fraud there, but that's how easy it should be. You should be able to go, hey, you did that and you found this result. We wouldn't mind looking at your results. It's not. So you're right. There are people that are bad faith actors, but eventually you can ask them to put their money where their mouth is. It's like poker. If someone is bluffing, you can eventually call them, and it's not going to end well for them.
All right. Well, David Robert Grimes, thank you so much. Your latest book is called Good Thinking, and if anyone that's interested in good thinking, you should pick up a copy and read it. Any last thoughts?
One thing I would say, and it's very hard, I imagine for your audience in particular, probably hold themselves to a very high standard on being right about things. But I know I said this at the beginning, but I'm going to reiterate it. There is never any shame in being wrong. And the more you discover about something, the more nuanced things tend to become. The only shame in life is in not updating our beliefs when they're shown to no longer be viable. And that leads us into danger and bad things. And I'd also say that no one ever changes anyone else's mind. You just give people the freedom to change their own mind, and they give you the freedom and the tools to change yours. So it would be lovely if we could live in a slightly less combative world, but where we're all really interested about discovering truths together rather than in opposition. Maybe I'm very much hippie-ish and John Lennon-ish there, but I do hope that sticks in people's minds, because you know what? It doesn't need to be as aggressive as it is. And hopefully we can move towards that too.
That's great. If people want to find out more about you, they can read your book. Are you online? Do you have a website?
I am. I am on Twitter at DORG1985. And I am on Instagram at David_Robert_Grimes. And my website is davidrobertgrimes.com. So very easy to find.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David, for taking the time. This has been great.
Absolute
And
pleasure.
I hope our listeners enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.
I hope so too. You take it easy and have a great day. Okay.
You too. Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.